1949, one of the highest honors in all of science, the Nobel Prize in Medicine, was given to a man for inventing a procedure that we now consider one of the most barbaric mistakes in the history of medicine. The procedure destroyed tens of thousands of minds. It left people unable to speak, unable to care for themselves, unable to feel anything at all. Some of them died on the table. And the prize that celebrated it has never been taken back, to this day. Most people think the lobotomy was some fringe horror practiced in the shadows by quacks. It wasn't. It was mainstream, celebrated medicine, endorsed by the most prestigious scientific institution on Earth. And the real story of how that happened is far darker than the myth. Let's start with the man who won the prize. His name was António Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist. And before we get to the horror, it's worth saying, he was a genuinely brilliant scientist. He developed cerebral angiography, a technique for imaging the blood vessels of the brain that was so important it remained the primary method for diagnosing brain disorders until the CT scanner arrived in the 1970s. That work alone probably deserved a Nobel Prize. But that's not what he won it for. In 1935, Moniz became convinced that mental illness came from faulty, fixed pathways in the brain, bad connections that trapped a person in their suffering. And his solution was as simple as it was terrifying. If the connections were the problem, then you cut them. On November 12, 1935, his technique was used for the first time. The method involved drilling holes into the skull and destroying the connections to the frontal lobes, the part of the brain responsible for personality, planning, judgment, everything that makes you recognizably you. He called it leucotomy. The early results looked, on the surface, like a miracle. Anxious patients became calm. Agitated patients became docile. The screaming stopped. And to a medical world that had absolutely no effective treatment for severe mental illness, no medications, nothing, a procedure that could quiet a suffering patient looked like salvation. Nobody was measuring what was being lost, because what was actually happening was this. The patients weren't cured. Their personalities were being erased. The calm wasn't peace. It was the absence of a person. But in 1935, nobody was looking closely enough to see the difference. They saw quiet patients, and they called it success. And then the idea crossed the Atlantic, and it got much, much worse. Enter an American neurologist named Walter Freeman. Freeman took Moniz's operation, renamed it the lobotomy, and performed the first one in the United States in 1936 with his surgical partner, James Watts. But Freeman had a frustration. Moniz's method required a real operating room, a real neurosurgeon, anesthesia, sterile equipment. It was slow and expensive, and America's psychiatric hospitals were overflowing with tens of thousands of patients nobody knew what to do with. Freeman wanted something faster, something that didn't need a surgeon at all. So he invented the transorbital lobotomy. And this is where the story becomes genuinely hard to hear. Freeman realized he could reach the frontal lobes without drilling through the skull. There was a thinner path, through the eye. He would knock the patient unconscious using electroshock, not anesthesia, electroshock. Then he would lift the eyelid, place a thin metal instrument that closely resembled an ice pick against the top of the eye socket, and drive it through the thin layer of bone with a mallet. Once it was inside the brain, he would sweep it back and forth to destroy the connections in the frontal lobe. The entire thing took under 10 minutes. No operating room, no neurosurgeon, often no real sterilization at all. For the very first ones, he literally used an ice pick from his own kitchen. And Freeman didn't hide this. He loved it. He was a showman. He would perform lobotomies in front of crowds of doctors and journalists. He'd demonstrate that he could do it with either hand. He encouraged the audience to time him so he could try to break his own speed record. Sometimes he would do 2 at once, 1 through each eye. Then he took it on the road. Freeman bought a van, fitted it out, and drove across the country performing lobotomies at psychiatric hospitals wherever he stopped. People started calling it the lobotomobile. In 1 year, he crossed the United States 11 times. In a single 2-week stretch in West Virginia in 1952, he personally performed 228 lobotomies, a state-sponsored project that newspapers actually nicknamed Operation Ice Pick. Over his career, Freeman performed or supervised around 3,500 of these operations. An estimated 490 of his patients died, and his patients were not all violent or hopeless cases. One of them was a 12-year-old boy whose crime was behavioral problems at school. Another was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of a future president of the United States. She was 23, with what seemed to have been relatively mild difficulties. The lobotomy left her permanently incapacitated, unable to walk or speak properly, and she required full-time care for the rest of her life. More than 60 years. In total, more than 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone, most of them between 1949 and 1952. Tens of thousands of people walked into a room as themselves and walked out as something hollowed out, or didn't walk out at all. And now here is the part that ties it all together, the part that makes the Nobel Prize almost impossible to defend. In 1949, the Nobel Committee awarded Moniz the prize in medicine for his discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses. And the man who nominated him for it was Walter Freeman. The showman with the ice pick and the lobotomobile personally pushed for the inventor of the procedure to receive the highest honor in science. And it worked. The prize gave the entire practice the ultimate stamp of legitimacy. If it won a Nobel, how could it be wrong? Lobotomy rates in America spiked in the years immediately after the award. The prize didn't just honor the procedure, it accelerated it. So why did it happen? The honest answer is that the medical world was desperate and ignorant at the same time. There were no antipsychotic drugs yet. Hospitals were packed with suffering people, and no one had a single effective tool to help them. Into that vacuum stepped a procedure that appeared to work, backed by a brilliant scientist and promoted by a relentless showman. The follow-up studies were short. The patients who were destroyed weren't counted as failures, because no one defined what a real success even was. And by the time anyone looked closely, the practice had a Nobel Prize sitting on top of it, making it almost untouchable. The whole thing collapsed almost overnight in the mid-1950s, not because of ethics, because of a pill. A drug called chlorpromazine arrived, the first real antipsychotic medication, and it could calm patients without hammering an ice pick through their skull. Almost immediately, the lobotomy became obsolete, and once it was obsolete, the world was finally free to see it for what it had always been. Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967, on a woman named Helen Mortensen. It was her third one from him. She died of a brain hemorrhage, and after that, he was finally banned from operating. But Moniz's Nobel Prize remained. Over the decades, families of lobotomy victims have repeatedly petitioned the Nobel Committee to rescind it, to acknowledge, formally, that the prize was a mistake. The committee has always refused. Their position is that the award has to be understood in the context of its time, that Moniz's work was judged by the knowledge available in 1949, and that the prize is a historical record, not an ongoing endorsement. And so it stands, a Nobel Prize in medicine still officially awarded for a procedure that mutilated tens of thousands of people. Here's what the whole story actually leaves you with. We like to imagine that atrocities in medicine are committed by obvious villains, by people operating in the dark, breaking the rules. But the lobotomy wasn't that. It was celebrated. It was award-winning. It was performed by respected men in front of applauding crowds, blessed by the highest institution in science, and covered admiringly in the newspapers. It wasn't the failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed and being catastrophically, tragically wrong anyway. The people who did it weren't hiding. They thought they were heroes. And that is the part that should genuinely keep you up at night. Because every era believes its medicine is the enlightened one. Every era believes it has finally left the barbarism behind, including ours.